very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for organising this, by the way, Anna. I'm a co-curator at this amazing exhibition, one of three, and I'm also a painter-printmaker, so I'm an elected member of the Royal Society of Painter-Printmakers. That's what this ARE stands for. I started my career, I suppose, after graduating from Edinburgh College of Art, where I did my first degree in drawing and painting, and then I went to Sweden, where I lived for 7 years, and did a second degree in printmaking, and that was followed by a master's in European Fine Art in Barcelona, so a bit of a potted history there. I'm going to start by giving you a bit of background on how I became involved in this exhibition. I was invited by Tim Craven, he's actually the chap who came up with the whole concept for Paradise Found, this incredible exhibition. It's sort of been on his mind for a few years now, and he wanted to do something with the Camden Town Group. We met basically when we were both exhibiting in adjacent galleries in Bath in about 2011, and at the time I was doing research into my great-grandfather, who was also a founding member of the Camden Town Group. His name is Malcolm Drummond, and I discovered that Tim was chief curator at Southampton City Art Gallery, and they house one of the best collections of Malcolm Drummond's work. So of course I bombed up there and saw some wonderful paintings of his. This one is in their collection. It's one of his most famous paintings. And while I was there, Tim announced that it has been chosen by number 10 Downing Street, because they changed their selection of art every few years. So that was hanging there briefly. It's quite a large painting. And it was inspired by Georges Seurat, who he was a big fan of, an impressionist, French impressionist. And you can, if you know the painting, The Bathers, there is a sort of synergy with the way he's composed this painting and the use of colours. He was also a painter-printmaker. He trained in painting and drawing at the Slade, and he also later on trained with Walter Sickert in printmaking. So they became great friends, and he got to know many of the other Camden Town Group members as personal friends, including Robert Evan. So what is, for me, tying everything together in terms of my curating here is a love of colour, which I've clearly inherited from Malcolm Drummond. I'd say dynamic composition is something I'm very interested in, which is something that he was known for. So that leads me on to an exhibition. This is just sort of giving you some background on how I made the choice of the 12 artists that are hanging in this show. So while I was at Southampton City Art Gallery, Tim then, much to my surprise, invited me to participate in a groundbreaking exhibition called Under the Greenwood, Picturing the British Tree, from Constable to Kurt Jackson, which was held at St Barbe Museum and Art Gallery in Lymington. And it was unusual because it was going to focus entirely on trees as the main subject. And again, much to my amazement, I found myself in the same show as Malcolm Drummond and as some of the other members of the Camden Town Group. They were artists from the early 1800s to the 20th century, including Paul Nash, Graham Sutherland, Samuel Palmer, John Constable, and there were some incredible contemporary artists, very established artists there, including Michael Porter, who's in the show, Michel Dovey, and Abby Kremer, Tim Craven, Philippa Beale and myself. So we were all in this very first exhibition which preempted the next stage, which is the founding of the Arborealists. So this came out of that initial exhibition. This was actually our inaugural exhibition, which was held at the Royal Academy of West England. It was called The Art of Trees, the Arborealists and Other Artists. So the name has already been coined before it turned into a formal group. I had two paintings in the show alongside Michel Davy. We're both colourists, we're painterly artists. And so we were sort of hung together like this, which is really quite exciting. It was such a success that we ended up taking some of the original group from the Under the Greenwood into the Arborealists. And as I pointed out, some of those artists are now hanging in this exhibition. So this is just a shot from the gallery in the Royal Academy of West England. And it's just to point out drawing, and Michael Porter is hanging to the left of my drawing, and Kurt Jackson is on the right. And it's sort of the beginning of one of the topics that came up when I was talking to one of my artists. So what I've decided to do is focus on 4 artists, because I can't unfortunately discuss all 12 of them. But I've sort of chosen them, and I've done a bit of an interview with them to get a sense of why they wanted to exhibit in this show and what their work was about. So it was very interesting talking to Wendy Rose. So she's made a drawing right at the end of the gallery, which we'll get to a bit later. But one of the topics of conversation was about the time taken to make a drawing on location. And she had this theory that the maximum time needed to capture the essence of something is 20 minutes. But of course, the drawing I've made here from this particular exhibition took 10 days. So there are lots of reasons for making drawings. They might be as simple sketches for paintings as a starting point, which you then take back into the studio, or they could be finished works of art in their own right. That's what Wendy's ended up with her wonderful drawing. That's an example of a drawing made on 6 sheets of paper, pieced together like a sort of jigsaw and drawn from life. And in a sort of a grid in a way, and that was another thing that the Camden Town Group did when they would always sketch outside or from life, and they would then do something called squaring up and convert those into, or sort of size them up onto much larger canvases to make their finished paintings. So this just takes me to Sandra Higgins, who's the 3rd curator. So Tim was looking for another curator, having invited me to curate Paradise Found with him. And of course I started working with her at the beginning of lockdown, and this is a painting that I did for one of her shows, which is called Shades of Green, again on the subject of trees. But she seemed like a very good person to involve, because her idea during lockdown was to invite artists to walk around the amazing landscape that she lives in, which is called Englishcombe. It's on the outskirts of Bath, and it's also an area of great, of sort of natural beauty protected, designated landscape. And so she already had some experience of working in this type of a format where you you respond to a specific landscape, although we had a little bit longer because we had lockdown. So here we are in the gallery with Paradise Found, New Visions of Blackdown Hills. So Tim was keen to do this. He represents several of the Camden Town Group painters in the Southampton City Art Gallery as a curator there, but he's now retired from Southampton, and he's working himself as a full-time artist and also curating lots of exhibitions. So this is a great dream of his, and it's really fantastic to have the show here in this really beautiful gallery. Actually, it fits really well, and also because it's so close to the location, the Blackdown Hills. I think there are quite a few people here who live in that area, I believe. Of course, when Tim told me about this idea for Paradise Found, I was extremely interested because of my link to Malcolm Drummond, who he was great personal friends with Robert Bevan's family, and he'd also painted members of the family. And of course, my father just lives down the road in Tiverton, has been there for many years. So I must have driven past this part of Devon, but I didn't really know anything about the Blackdown Hills, I'm ashamed to say. But I think it's a really fantastic idea. These are all of my artists. So you can just imagine there were 3 curators, 36 artists, and therefore we split them into groups of 3, which meant 12 per curator, obviously with myself and Tim being one of the artists. And we then split them again into groups of 3, so that's 2 contemporary artists with 1 Camden Town Group artist. So, quite an interesting way of doing it. And then the artists then had to respond to those specific locations. So just to fill you in a little bit on some of these amazing artists, because I can't talk about them all. We've got Michael Porter, who will be talking about a bit later. Will Vaughan. I've shown with him in a few exhibitions, including one at Southampton, which is called Capture the Castle. And this is a dry point, which is combined actually with charcoal. And he's known for making often sketches, drawings and prints of ruined buildings in quite romantic landscapes. So then we've got Stella Carr, who is an arborealist. She's a bit of a colourist. She also works with natural pigments, and she's not just a painter but also a printmaker. Kate Measham, she's made very colourist painting and drawing, and I was very struck with her work when I met her the first time, so I'm very glad she's in the show. Likewise, Dan McCarthy, I met him doing a residency at the Sidney Nolan Trust, and he was doing a year-long residency there, and I was immediately interested in his colourist approach and quite sort of symbolic use of colour as well. Frank Kreber and Ferhav Faruqi, they both live in London, interestingly, so they don't normally venture out of the big city. So I just felt it would be really interesting to invite them, having shown with them a few times in London. Particularly Ferhav, she described how she felt it was, out of her comfort zone. That's a word that I heard several times from artists, that they were sort of being pushed out of their comfort zones, which is always a good thing. And it was the first time she'd actually gone and focused on a rural subject, so I thought that was really, really interesting for her, and she found it very illuminating. So Michelle Dovey, who I'm going to be talking about a bit later, and Abby Creamer, both arborealists. and Wendy Rose, who we'll be talking about later. And then Ange Mullen-Bryan, well, she interested me. I'd been aware of her work for some time, because she lives in Gloucestershire. But she has family in Sweden, so that's a sort of a connection, because I live there. And she normally focuses on painting, actually sort of Swedish landscapes from memory. So she'll go out there, gather material, come back, and then actually make the paintings in England. It's quite an interesting way of doing it. So again, very interesting to see her responding to something quintessentially English, I thought. So if we come to this, this shows you how the artists were split up. Okay, so Michael Porter with Spencer Gore, Edge of the Wood. Quite a few with Robert Bevan. Wendy Rose also with Spencer Gore. And then two artists with Stanislawa Karlowska. The other thing that we had to contend with was an OS map. Some people better map readers than others. But bearing in mind that almost all of us managed to find our way to our locations on our own, I think it was pretty amazing that there weren't really any issues at all. Obviously, some people were able to make use of sat-nav, but it can only take you so far, I think, in the hills. But we were each given our own grid reference, and then it was up to us to try and find it. So this is my shared location, because obviously I was put together with Michel Davy and Benedict Brain, who's actually one of Sandra Higgins' artists, but it's only fair to mention him because we were in the same location. So we were given Robert Bevan's The Hay Harvest, painted in 1916. It's quite interesting because Michel and I, obviously, as you can see right from the beginning, we'd known each other in that very first exhibition under the Greenwood, and then became Arborealists together. So we were well acquainted with each other's work, but we'd never actually gone off and spent time together sketching. It's quite an intimate thing to do for an artist, to spend time with another artist. But somehow this project prompted us to do, all of us to do stuff that we hadn't done before. So we took off together. We stayed in a friend's house, and then we spent 2 days down in the Blackdown Hills. We spent about actually 2 hours when we arrived, walking around the area, trying to locate what we thought was close to this original view, and it was quite tricky at first. Of course, clearly Robert Bevan had painted this at the height of summer, and even though the Camden Town Group were known for not romanticising or sentimentalising their subjects, they were interested in depicting people going about their daily tasks, ordinary people. To our modern eyes, this does look quite romantic, I think, because you've got a horse-drawn plough, and also the way he's created quite bold patterns across the field. It does give you a real sense of the height of summer and the warmth of it. So that was the first thing that we had to contend with, because by the time we got there, it was November. Many of my artists had the presence of mind, or for whatever reason, we couldn't all manage to get down there due to other projects in the spring or the summer. I wasn't personally able to until quite late on, for obvious reasons. So we sort of had a slightly different experience, I suppose, and so did, interestingly, Benedict Brain, who's a photographer. He went down there in January, so we clearly experienced winter in the Blackdown Hills. So this shows you, this is a picture Michel took of me sketching. This was day one. This is looking across to Hart's Farm from a distance, so we're pretty much in that field. And if you go back again, and you can see that's Hart's Farm, but it's a sort of ancient building nestling amongst the trees and the bushes. And then 2023, or 2022, sorry, but at this point, it's flanked by these enormous modern cattle sheds. Well, I think we were quite shocked when we arrived, to be honest, because it wasn't the sort of romantic idyll that we'd imagined it would be. Plus, it was starting to rain, and it was freezing cold, and we were both wearing thermals, thick socks, and woolly hats and things, and we had thermos of hot tea to try and sort of. This is what you have to do if you're. I mean, we are what you describe as plein air artists, and although I go back into the studio and so does Michel to develop work, but we always have to start outside. So this is the interesting thing about it. There are so many different ways of making art, but for us it's the experience of actually being there. So Michel walked a great distance. She walked all the way to the bottom of that field, and she found a sort of area under the bushes where she could get some sort of cover from the rain. And I, looking around, there wasn't much in this field apart from a massive big oak tree. So I went and sat under the oak tree, and that sort of protected me. And then I made lots of small sketches, like this on the right, sort of sketchbook stuff. And then I made a much larger charcoal drawing on the left. And these became the grand work for a copper etching. So this is me developing the copper etching. This is the process. It's quite a long process, really. Again, not in a normal state of things, both of us artists would have made very vibrant colourist work, but I just think it's interesting how the environment influences an artist, and we actually sort of both out of character, really. We made quite monochrome works, but I think they're very atmospheric and very expressive of how we were feeling and what the weather was doing at the time. And that is the job of the artist. So here I was sort of applying a hard ground to the copper plate, and then you scrape through it, you draw through it with an etching needle. I use lots of other techniques like spit bite, using aquatint. It's a way of creating a sort of almost like an airbrush effect, but you can etch it so you get a tone, and then you can manipulate it by working quite in a painterly way with ferric chloride on the plate, so you can build up lots of interesting techniques. That's me inking up one of the plates, so I work with two plates, one printed on top of the other. So you can see plate 2 is red, dark red colour, and then the main plate, which is the one on the left that you can see, that's just after it's all been inked and then wiped. There are lots of techniques of wiping the plate with tarlatan, which is sort of like muslin, and then also using newsprint and finally your hand. But you don't want to remove too much ink because some of it is dry point as well. So it's a mixture of etching and dry point, and then taking it through the press. And ending up with this. So you can see that Robert Bevan side by side with it. So two different moods really, the height of summer and the, the depths of winter. But, you know, they're both valid interpretations. So then we come to Michelle. And Michelle, as I said before, she walked to the very end of the field. She found some coverage under these sort of bushes, trees, and there's a little brook at the end where the cows are disappearing over. So if you sit there, hang on, let's go further on there, you can just about see Hart's Farm through the trees. That's what she was looking at and responding to. And of course, the first day was, there were some glimmers of sunshine and then the rain started. So interestingly, Michelle had started with quite colourist work. And then as the day evolved and then the following day it was very overcast and raining. So her work completely switched. And this is one of her first big ink drawings, which is, I think, really very interesting indeed. And that's the one that's hanging in the show, it's upstairs. So they're quite big drawings. I think they're really beautiful, very spontaneous, they're made in situ with Indian ink. And she, you know, it was quite a lot to contend with. She was literally on the cow track, just as the cows were coming back, going back up the hill on a designated track. And she had to move all her art equipment in a great hurry. So this is Benedict Brain. So he, as I said before, he made his way down there by himself, following my rather sort of crude instructions, but he managed to find the farm very easily. And so unlike myself and Michelle, he decided to make close-up as work of the actual farm, which I think is very interesting. They look very sort of abstract, semi-abstract, almost quite painterly, really. And so he said he met the owners of the farm who he chatted to. He said he was very happy to discover they knew quite a lot about the Camden Town Group and were very, very interested in this exhibition. And when he arrived in January, he said it was a cold and crisp, very sunny day. So very sort of quite strong light, rather different from what we experienced. But he said that he likes that type of light. He calls it low raking light. And against the modern farm machinery, which he said, to him it looked quite sort of aggressive, but combined with this sort of, I don't know, whatever it is, it's a bit of fabric that's been draped across, looks like a bit of corrugated iron. So he likes this idea of contrasting textures and really striking sort of lighting effects. He uses a digital camera with a wide 35mm lens. He first being technically very simple and straightforward in his way of working. He finds that the close-up views, he finds personally, they're more engaging than what huge big wide vistas. So I think that us three clearly felt very strongly that the area, although very beautiful and romanticised as a sort of idyll of British rural life, it also created conflicting feelings within all three of us. I think because of that enormous change that we saw with that contrast between Bevan's painting and the reality of the farm and being sort of engulfed by those modern buildings. It was a bit of a jolt to our artistic sensibilities, I suppose. But also, Ben was talking about our relationship with nature and the dichotomy of what he described as often barbaric farming practices. So, you know, that's just, I think, how one can interpret some of the landscape and what's happening in this country at the moment. And the other thing is, with the hayfield, Bevan's hayfield, there would have been a much wider diversity of wildlife, all the stuff that we sort of lost, butterflies and insects, etc. And I know that there are sort of moves by a lot of farmers now to try and bring some of that stuff back. So that's really great. So then we get to Michael Porter. So he was painting Spencer Gore's The Edge of the Wood from 1911. Spencer Gore is, I think they're very beautiful. They're quite, this particular painting is quite sort of impressionist, almost pointillist, and quite sort of abstract as well. And I think I can see why it would have appealed to Michael in the way that it does, because he has a very interesting way of working. You know, he also, like us, feels the need to spend a significant amount of time in a location so he can get to know it properly. And he'll often combine photography with painting techniques, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And in fact, he will also gather organic matter on his journey within the landscape, and so that sort of ends up in the painting, because he might use it as, say, almost like a sort of collage that he can paint through, you know, to create interesting shapes, like sort of masking, I suppose. And then build layers up. So I know, having talked about Michael's work in the past, that sometimes he'll take photographs and then he'll work back into them with oils and acrylics, and because they're opposing media, you know, the oil spends the water, and then really interesting patterns and shapes that mimic nature appear, and that's fascinating when it's combined with the photography, which you will then re-photograph with all those painted effects, and then work back into it again with paint media, and then maybe re-photograph that, and maybe do that several times to build up lots and lots of layers. And I think what struck me is they remind me a bit of people like Anthony Tapias, the Catalonian matter painter. I don't know how many people have heard of him. And also Anselm Kiefer, who's a neo-German expressionist. And they will often incorporate physical materials of landscape directly into their works. So the other thing I think that is interesting about Michael's work is this idea that you can sort of combine this split second that you get from taking a photograph with, you know, the enormous amount of time that it takes to build up a painting. So it's like two methodologies coming together in a fascinating way. The other thing is that he often works on the floor or on tables, working on the flat, so quite different perhaps from how myself and Michelle work, which is on the wall or on the easel generally. So, you know, it's another interesting approach to painting, and makes this exhibition very, you know, diverse. So that takes us to Wendy Rhodes. So, as I said before, I had a very interesting conversation with Wendy. She did her PhD on techniques or similarities and differences between the practice of drawing and printmaking. Because she exclusively draws, she doesn't paint, or she makes prints. So that's quite interesting. And she only draws with charcoal or graphite. And she tends to make a dry point print. So I was sort of expecting she would make a print for this show, but in fact she chose to make a really beautiful drawing. She was given this beautiful painting to work on, which was called Edge of the Wood at Applehays. And so she started doing sort of very small sketchbook stuff to sort of acclimatise really. And she then worked up a larger charcoal drawing. But again, she's got this thing about time, which is the sort of the 20-minute theory, the minimum time for creating an important memory. She talked a lot about total immersion and the importance of trying to get the quality of place through this total immersion. But of course, it's personal for all of us how we perceive that and how we express it as artists. But I think what came out of this is that most of us prefer to spend a lot of time getting to know a location before we respond to it. So this is Wendy's drawing, and that's Spencer Gore's painting on the left. So it's like a sort of brook, which you can't see in Spencer Gore's painting, but Wendy clearly chose to focus entirely on the reflections rather than the actual trees, which I think is really interesting. And her reasoning for that is she's interested in, she says surface patterns. And when she was there, it was the light was quite striking, quite strong. But she said it was only when the sun went in that she found it interesting, because it started becoming quite sort of blurry and cloudy. And somehow the reflections, she just found them far more interesting than when they were really, really sharp. So that's one of her reasonings. So this takes me to Abby Kremer. She's also an arborealist painter, and she's a great colourist, and she'll do very quick sketches outdoors, but she's due to the media that she's chosen, which is watercolour and inks on paper. She spends a lot of time in the studio developing the work, because of course it's easier with that type of media. And she's very interested in dance and music. That's always played a great part in her life. She even worked with dancers at one point, and you can sort of see that in the marks that she makes. They're quite lively, and what I think is interesting about this is as she's responded to Charles Ginner's painting of Clay Hyden, 1913, she sort of tipped it up so that it's vertical, and then she's picked out some of the sort of interesting patterns that are happening in Ginner's painting. Like these sort of lines up here, these orange lines at the top, and then she sort of brought them down here. And she's picked out the oranges and the purples, and she's pitch the green so that they're sort of quite yellowy. I just think it's fascinating, and she's called it personages because she's got a great interest in people like Paul Nash, and he was the first artist to coin that idea of personages, although I'm sure that comes from poetry, in fact. But it's this idea of seeing something recognisable in organic, natural objects, whether it be trees or landscapes or any other inanimate object, actually. So she's seeing these pylons as personages. I think that's quite interesting. So this brings me sort of coming to the end of the talk. So this is one of mine. This is what my paintings can look like. But these are slightly different from the earlier ones because these are using hand-mulled pigments, which I was demonstrating this morning. So they're sort of fresco-like because they're the same sort of pigments that would be used to make a fresco. And I'm showing you this because I'm going to be giving another talk. It's called Dreaming the Land at the City Nolan Trust, because that's a residency that I conducted there not long ago. And it's going to be happening at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution on Wednesday the 10th of May. And so I was talking about this earlier today. So you've got the green colour is malachite, that's copper. You've got lapis lazuli, the blue colour, the darker blue colour, that is. You've got various ochres in there, you've got Naples yellow. So,
what does hand-mulled mean?
What does it mean? It means I've done it myself, rather than buying it ready-made. Because you can buy these paints, for example, Pitt Seymour makes them now.
Right, so you ground it.
But I've done it myself.
Right.
Okay, so... And here I am. And that's malachite on the left. And then these are some of the red there is actually cinnabar, sort of quite toxic, but you handled in the right way, it's absolutely fine. You've got, that's lapis, that beautiful blue there, that's genuine lapis. And that's ivory black, not genuine ivory, it's bone black basically. And then that's Naples yellow, that's instead of orpiment is extremely toxic and it gives off fumes. And so traditionally that's what conservatives are now using instead. They recommend using Naples instead of orpiment. So that just gives you an idea. And then finally, this is about to happen, actually. This is another talk, although it's artists in conversation. So Sandra Higgins, who represents me, is running a series of talks. So she's staging an exhibition at the viewing room, Hansard, it's actually the Hansard studio. She's calling the show The Viewing Room. And we are talking, myself, in conversations with Louise Burnett Hall on the 4th of May. And these are two of the paintings that are in this show. So combining, I have been sort of combining more modern but very high quality paints with some of these mineral pigments, getting quite interesting effects. So this is to end on the talk, just reminding you again of all of my amazing artists and hoping that you've enjoyed it. So just before I finish, I just wanted to recap on what the common denominator was between all of us, and that clearly was our love of colour and strong composition, a wide variety of materials and expression, and I think also we were very much influenced by the different times of year, the weather, the light, and environmental concerns have influenced many of us quite a lot. But it's also shed new light on the importance of preserving places like the Blackdown Hills. So, not just experiencing it as some sort of a retreat from the city, but as an important natural habitat for a variety of endangered species. So I think the gathering of memories is crucial. The total immersion, as I mentioned before, in place for a length of time, that helps to deepen a range of memories, not just visual memories, but what you would describe as muscle memory. So the act of drawing helps to embed those memories. And also, the sounds that you hear. It's extraordinary how you can take all of that back to you to the studio, and it becomes a bit of a sort of channeling exercise. It just strengthens your memories more than just taking a quick photo and then retreating immediately. Spending significant time definitely makes a huge difference. So I think generally there was a powerful sense of intimacy in having retraced the footsteps of the Camden Town Group artists and feeling this time passing. And I think it was, just a really interesting experience, and it definitely challenged all of us and has, opened our eyes to responding in this way to a landscape that we perhaps wouldn't have thought of visiting. So I think that wraps it up, really.
I'd like to say thank you very much.
Yes.